Ed Harrow here for the fabulous Ed Talks program, which doesn't have a real name yet, but that's what we're calling it. And I'm sitting here today, we're going to talk about invasive species taking over Hopkinton. And beside me, I have Miles Connors and Trevor Smith, who are going to give you a 2-minute dissertation on who they are and what they do. And then I want to give, as my usual intro to invasives, the argument that my parents used to have over the bittersweet growing up the side of the barn. My mother loved the bittersweet. She'd do all kinds of marvelous things, weaving it and so forth and so on. My father hated the bittersweet because he said it's going to tear the barn down. He was more explicit than that, but I'll leave it at that. Miles, sir.
Nice to be with you, Ed. My name's Miles Connors. I'm the director with Parterre Ecological. We focus on invasive plant management and native restoration work in the greater Boston area.
I'm Trevor Smith. I am the Director of Education and Design at Weston Nurseries, and I've been in regenerative land care for the past 25 years.
So my introduction in Hopkinton to this was in my role on open space when, heaven help us, I was made the chair of the commission, and I decided rather than walking around the perimeter of the Whitehall Conservation Area, I'd walk through it. And to say that it was impassable for bittersweet would be an understatement. It was literally stepping over, crawling under on the path that was nearly obliterated. So we called Parterre and said, help us. And when, I guess the first thing that we did, I need to back up one step. We had a Hopkinton area landscaping group, the name will come to me, give us a quote to come and basically cut the place out with the brush hog. And they did that, and they were about 3/4 through with the job when the police department received a complaint that we were violating the conservation restriction on the property. It was a long and complicated process before we got to the point that we could have Parterre come. So now, sir, can you give us a little talk about what you did and how you went about doing it?
And this is particularly with the Japanese knotweed management?
Right.
Yeah, so in that particular environment, we came in, we obviously, in this open kind of like old field, or, you know, and I call it an old field because traditionally it had been mowed once a year, so you had a lot of woody plant material in there. And in one portion of it, against this woodland side, it was Japanese knotweed. Probably at the top of the list of invasive plant species in Massachusetts, very tough to get rid of. And can actually wreak havoc on a lot of like infrastructure. So whether it's like foundations or driveways, walkways, it has a woody root. It can go down 3 to 6 feet deep, spread out by rhizome, and really the only way of getting rid of it permanently is with a safe herbicide application. So our field technicians and myself went to the site. First is the identification of the knotweed itself, and then we, at the appropriate time of year, we would cut the plant, allow it to regrow, and then as it comes into flower in the late part of the summer, we would do a topical treatment of herbicide to the leaves. And we've done that over the course of, it can take up to 3 to 5 years to really diminish the population. It is definitely not a one and done. It takes some time to eradicate Japanese knotweed.
Yeah, this is we've done 3 times at this point. And it's still a bit early yet to tell whether it's going to come up, but I'm quite confident that there's more to show up without a doubt. And we'll be calling you and saying, as Ernie Bach used to say, come on down.
Yeah.
Facts.
And I think at this particular location too, it's like it should be noted that it was a small population. Like it had not spread throughout this conservation area. So it was very isolated and a really great time to start the work.
Now, out of curiosity, because the other thing that's there in copious quantities is bittersweet. When we first were there, when we were first doing the mowing job, there were 2 trees of like this sort of size that were broken off from the bittersweet that had grown up and pulled them down. There's an flowering apple tree and a flowering cherry tree that was severely compromised with the bittersweet. And bittersweet grows up trees, and correct me if I'm wrong, then it ends up shading the leaves on the trees, which kills the trees, so the tree becomes basically a supporting skeleton until it kind of rots and all falls down. And there's multiple examples of this in Hopkinton, and I think one of the things that might be interesting would be to corral HCAM in a vehicle and go on a tour to kind of give people a sighting of what this is and where it is. And Trevor, sir.
Yes, sir.
How about you?
So how about me? Well, coming at it where Miles is in definitely invasive control, I focus on invasive education. So bittersweet and knotweed, definitely two of the ones that I deal with most when I'm visiting people's properties or when I'm going to conservation sites to talk about reclamation and really how to balance out the ecology. And really what it is with invasives is it goes all the way back to plants. So plants evolved for animals to move their seeds around. Well, we are animals, and animals from buffalo, to mice move seeds around. Elephants as well. It doesn't matter how big or how small, they're all moving seeds around. We too, like I said, have moved seeds around. Plants evolved to have us do this. We just got very good at it because we actually didn't move them like a mile or 5 miles. We moved them, 500,000 miles, from continent to continent. So we're a little too prolific in moving those seeds and moving those plants because of our curiosity. The problem with invasives, really the two issues, is when you move them so far that you are moving them away from their natural controls. Any natural pathogen that would keep the populations down, any natural insect or anything that would eat it that would keep the populations in check. So by moving them away from their natural, controls, they are able to just spread prolifically. And that's really like the first problem that we didn't necessarily think of. The next issue that, you and Miles have seen extensively is that invasive carry a lot of seed. Not necessarily as much the knotweed, but bittersweet for sure, garlic mustard for sure. So they're throwing a lot of seed, more so than many of our native plants. So they're throwing all that seed, and then the third advantage that they have is they usually leaf out earlier or stay in leaf later. Usually they leaf out earlier than our native plants, so they get a jump start. Before our native plants are even out of bed, they're halfway through their day. So by doing that, they are able to take over or overtake populations of native areas and natural areas and just spread prolifically. Then we don't necessarily, for multiple years, we never paid attention to them. I grew up, I learned how to make wreaths weaving bittersweet with my grandmother. That's how I learned wreath basics, was making bittersweet wreaths with my grandmother that she would hang on her door in the fall. I mean,
yes.
It was gorgeous. But the thing is, we neglected them for so long, not really understanding. And they're like, oh, because I remember back 25 years ago going to people's property and they'd be like, oh yeah, I have some bamboo. I'm like, that's not bamboo. So we didn't really understand them enough. And then these populations got well established. So now we are in like a full force kind of assault on how to control them. Now controlling, everybody wants to be organic and everybody wants to be natural. I am a regenerative land care professional, so I've never used any pesticides, I've never used any herbicides. However, what people really need to understand is that when a site is really overrun, it is our job, since we basically caused the problem, to restore that balance. And sometimes specific and controlled use of some of these herbicides is necessary. And that's where you really want to hire a professional. We're not talking about spraying Roundup willy-nilly. You really want to bring in a professional, because a controlled use will not harm the surrounding ecosystem, will not harm any of our waterways or anything else. So that's where like Parterre Ecological comes in, because they know exactly what they're doing, they know exactly how to apply it, so not to affect the surrounding populations. But it's all about restoring balance, because the natives aren't going anywhere, but we can restore balance to an area where we have, healthy native plant systems and healthy ecosystems back that aren't being swallowed up. So what we need to do is restore the balance within that ecosystem so that we can bring back native populations which will soon then kind of repopulate and hopefully balance out that ecosystem that we're trying to restore.
Yeah, I know in the case when you mentioned bringing in professionals, when we looked at the problem we had at the Whitehall Conservation Area, we had to jump through some hoops because it is within the well protection zone for the Hopkinton water supply. So we had to get permissions hither, thither, and yon. Not for the mowing aspect, when we went in there with the brush hog to basically cut it down, but when we realized that we needed to resort to a more professional chemical process, that we had to go through those extra hoops. Now, knotweed in your applications, one of the ways is cutting it and then squirting in the stock is another treatment that you've done. I listened in on a Vermont Land Trust talk about dealing with knotweed, and they mentioned an item which I thought curious, that their knotweed that they're dealing with, at least in this is in northern Vermont, does not spread via seed. That the plants are all female. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. Primarily, Japanese knotweed will spread by rhizome, through the root
So
structure.
that's the main?
Yes. And so there can be a small rhizome or root that ends up on the side of the road through, being spread by, installation of different soil types. It's moved around that way, predominantly. And once that occurs, it's only a matter of time before it starts to create a larger population that then becomes a much larger issue as you go. And so we haven't really seen a lot of like seed that has moved from one place to another. It's usually in smaller patches of populations.
I think that's a positive.
Yeah.
And they do a lot of their work with smothering, and they cover it with tarps and billboard vinyl, which is a warm spot in my heart for those in Hopkins who will know that there were 2 billboards on land that's going to become open spaces land, and I was looking forward to them and their rental to help us out. But they're no longer with us. But we would have had an in-town source of billboard vinyl to use if we still had those billboards. I just have to get those points.
You do need to get something very heavy though, because I mean, knotweed comes up through asphalt.
Yeah.
And I've seen many people try to smother knotweed with tarps, and next thing you know, the tarps look like tents. They're like 2 feet in the air because the knotweed's just pushing up, right from under it. And while you said yes, it is great that the knotweed doesn't spread by seed, but the issue is many people try to dig up knotweed or in just excavation for homes, and then they go dump that soil. All you need is about an inch and a half, and you've sent a population somewhere else. So in regenerative land care, we are not so much about bringing in soil from other places. It's more about leave what's there, because you don't necessarily always know what you're bringing in. People are like, oh, new soil has got to be better than what I have. And we in regenerative land care advocate for amending what you have rather than continuing to move stuff around, because you can't always guarantee where that soil came from. It may come from a new home site with like lots of chopped up bits in it, and then you could be in trouble. So no seed, but lots of chopped up roots can cause just as much problem.
So, and there's no way of screening that out.
Well, you certainly can. For instance, with compost, say, when made properly, you cook it down. So like you're essentially, killing anything that's in there, and that's fine. But depending on where you buy, say, loam from, if it's not a reputable supplier, or if it's just, if you're trying to go for your cheapest loam, that will get brought in from different home sites and you don't always know what's there. So yes, it can be screened, but like I said, it doesn't take that much. So sometimes just that little bit. So most loam is screened, but depending how big that root is, if it's large enough, it'll certainly take over for you.
So we have an area in town beside Daniel Shays Road. Daniel Shays was the guy who started Shays Rebellion, Whiskey Rebellion, you may know it of from your early U.S. history, and he started out here in Hopkinton. And so there's a small pond there that was created via a dam at some point. I've been unable to establish when that happened, when the dam was put in there. And we were out there walking one day and got to the end of the dam, and there was this huge pile of dirt, and growing out of this huge pile of dirt was knotweed, right on the margins of Hopkinton property, on the margins of this lake and wetland, or pond and wetland. And I haven't been back since the town went knocking on the door and said, you know, get that out of here. But I have no idea if there's, you know, still remnants of knotweed there that will continue to spread.
Well, like Miles said, it goes 6 feet down in the ground, so it's not something you can easily dig up.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit to bittersweet, which happens to be another major hot button. If you've got, I mean, what I tend to do with bittersweet, I anger flashes across my face and I grab it and I rip it out of the ground, which might be effective in that particular case, but when you've got a large expanse of it, or you got, you know, I've got, you know, stock like this of bittersweet, you know, I took a chainsaw to. How do you deal with bittersweet?
So a couple methods of dealing with invasive plants in general, especially when they're woody plant species like bittersweet, buckthorn, multiflora rose. It's worth also noting that when we talk about invasive plant species, there's a list in Massachusetts, and that's put out by MIPAG, the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, and they have a list of invasive plant species, potentially invasive plant species, and likely. So when we're talking about invasives, like I'll go out and meet with people occasionally, and they'll say, "Oh, this Concord grape is invasive," and to me, that's an improper statement.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's a plant that can be aggressive in landscapes, but it's not on the invasive list.
Yep.
So that's worth noting, just in terms of when we speak about invasives. Bittersweet, definitely on that list. And when you're a couple ways of managing out woody invasives, mechanically. So you could get in and you could, you know, scrape it out. You could do your best to remove that root system entirely. Of course, manually, early detection, rapid response is what we talk about in the industry. So it's that early identification of the fact that you've got, you know, a bunch of small bittersweet sprouts that have started to pop up underneath a maple, and you go in and you just hand pull them. They come out, they have like ovate leaves, they have little orange roots.
What color?
Like ovate, meaning they're like, they're oval in shape. So they have orange roots. So early detection, rapid response. If you can identify them and uproot them by hand pulling them, that's a great early way of doing that. And then finally, like, you know, if you're dealing with something like bittersweet, that there is an herbicide application that you can do to the cut stump. So you can do, or foliar, but we tend to prefer a cut stump method. That being said, I often tell folks, once you cut that out of the tree and you have a larger caliper stump, you have to be committed to coming back seasonally for a few years to treat it. Because once you cut it out of the tree, its natural tendency is to sucker and to root throughout the root system. So you end up with like a small colony that comes and regrows through the root system.
I can attest to this.
Yeah. So you have to be committed to having like a repeat treatment over time. But those are a couple methods of managing not only bittersweet but other invasive plants mechanically, manually, and then also chemical application.
Another question I've got is when you have an extent of, I'm going to say in this particular case, knotweed that's on town property, and it's also on adjacent private property. What is a realistic means of trying to deal with that? And I'm dealing with this on the Conservation Commission, and we're told that, you know, we can do what's on town property, but, you know, we can't do what's on the private property. And so what's on the private property just becomes a nursery to help replenish. And so every year you're going back and doing the same thing over and over again. And as we know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is...
Definition of insanity.
Thank you.
I think that that's all really about like education and advocacy. I mean, we've been in similar situations like that, knotweed and other invasives. do not know property boundaries.
No.
It's not part of their language. Like, they are very much like, and we've worked with the butters a great deal to knocking on the front door, educating them about what they have, and going through that process of asking them if they are willing to take on the management as their neighbor has committed to doing. And many times they're like, thank you. Our landscaper has cut that down for a number of years. It continuously comes back. We've asked other professionals to come in and give us a hand in terms of how to get rid of this, and can you really do that? And it's like, yeah, this is the work that we do. But yeah, that I think would be the first element of it. And we've been before conservation as well, and absolutely, you can only really do and get approval for what you're doing on your own property.
What, do you know of case? So the other case that's similar to this is the subdivision that we looked at, you might remember, alongside the Sudbury River, called Turkey Ridge, where there's a portion of what's open space property with knotweed on it, and then it's behind all the private properties along the riverbank, like at least 3 or 4 properties. And I was so frustrated with that whole thing. I never got to the point of going knocking on people's doors and saying, would you like to help do something about this? But do you know of examples where I'll use the say town, where a town has this problem, it's on an abutting property, and the town has foot the bill to treat it on the abutting property? Obviously with the abutting property owner's agreement.
No, not through the town. We've worked with residential folks to do that. Like, with approval from their neighbors, they have managed. Yep. They've foot the bill for managing invasives off. And it could be the knotweed as an example, or the bittersweet is just snuck underneath the fence, and so you're treating up to that property edge. But then year after year, it just keeps coming back, and so we go around with approval and manage out that larger conservation. Conservation lands, there's a lot of grant opportunities for invasive plant management on a small and larger scale. But I think when it comes to managing multiple residential properties, town properties, etc., it just becomes really complicated because you're managing individual properties independently. Often there is costs associated with, or reduction of costs associated with the permitting end. You do still have to file individually with each property owner, but you can use that same narrative. You're mobilizing the team to the site, right? So there's cost reductions associated with that, but it is really looked at upon, managing each property individually.
And that's where it gets tricky. I mean, like Miles said, it's like grants are wonderful, and grants work more towards conservation land. But, especially with the issues that you're dealing with, what I noticed over my career was more in urban environments where we'd be coming under the fence, or somebody in the neighborhood is going to let the swallowwort grow on their fence, or whatever it is. And there's just so much seed, there's just so much activity in those areas. But again, you can ask somebody, hey, you want to take care of this, how much is it going to cost? Well, I'm not going to pay that. And then that just leads to not being able to get ahead of the problem. So if we were able to take the problem or the challenge of invasives a little more seriously and provide money for situations like Miles is talking about, where you can, the abutting properties, whether it be, mostly I would say in residential communities, because you'll be working on one property trying to install an entire meadow or a native landscape, and you'll have everything that you just had to eradicate on the other side of the fence. So we need to find ways to educate, as Miles said, and find ways to fund this to get ahead of it, because not everybody cares about their property or the ecosystem enough to want to put forth the money to eradicate it.
All right, gentlemen. I want to give an extra kudos to Trevor here, who's been very instrumental in doing some pollinator garden work in town. And I can attest, because he drove me, not physically drove me, he mentally drove me to show up and dig holes and shove plants in them, and then stop by later and water them periodically, and in one case cart the water from a nearby pond so that we could water the plants. Trevor does that to you, so if you work with Trevor, expect to do a little work on your own.
Wow. Yes. Expect a little maintenance, but native habitat. We have 4 gardens here, in Hopkinton designed to support our endangered native bee species. So I think that's worth carting a little water in.
And Miles, when he came to look at the White Elk Conservation Area, he stopped by our house and gave Cheryl, my wife, and I a little introduction on some of our plants, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And each year they have been back to treat this area of knotweed on our property, and I can attest that each year the pile gets smaller. As a parting shot, if you go and you cut the knotweed every week and just keep cutting it every week, do you win?
No.
So there you go. Thank you, and I hope you've all learned something. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. I've learned something.